Greetings. You'll often hear that putting a man on the moon, which the United States did for the first time in 1969 and then stopped doing about 4 years later, was the apex of human accomplishment. This is a popular view among older baby boomer conservative types because that happened during their youth. They were in the prime of their lives in 1969, give or take. And therefore, they are very convinced that this was the pinnacle of human achievement. And while that certainly was an important historical event within any story about human progress, to say that was the pinnacle of human achievement is very, very, very incorrect. And I'm going to show you a number of metrics to prove that's not the case so that you can whip out this video whenever you hear someone say something like that. So let's see some footage from that time.
Perhaps 50 years from now or more, when people think of the past, they will look at the pictures of last night. Without waiting that long, here is a shortened and edited version of last night's romantic and technical history.
Now, some of the fine print around the technological achievement of the moon landing is that it involved the work of 400,000 people, and given what the U.S. population was at the time, that would be like 650,000 members of the workforce involved in the Apollo program today. It also was extremely expensive. It consumed 1% of U.S. GDP for 8 years. That would be like spending $240 billion a year for 8 years today. So the moon landing was, in fact, brute forced with an extremely huge amount of money. It would have been much less expensive had it been done at a later time because technology would have advanced to a certain point. And ultimately, since humanity stopped going to the moon after a few years, that meant that virtually nothing after 1980, whether scientific or political, happened any differently, whether the United States had ever landed men on the moon or not at all. So ultimately, it's an example of an extreme amount of money and political will brute forcing an outcome. Now, it's good that it was a successful outcome because that money would have been spent even if the moon landing had not been successful. It would have been a sunk cost and an embarrassment for the United States. However, at least it was successful. But for people who say this was the pinnacle of human accomplishment and that it has been going downhill ever since, that is absurd. For one thing, the assumption there is that the United States is the only country in the world. But that's not even the most egregious error in that. Now, I could show you a lot of data that proves how much humanity has progressed since 1969, such as, for example, Moore's law. The number of transistors on a chip of constant cost has risen by a factor of about 50 million from 1970 to present, as you can see over here. And this is an exponential trend, but you've seen this before if you're a veteran of this channel. Or one could look at this chart of world poverty. World poverty took many centuries to get down from 95% to 60% by 1970, but from 1970 to present, it's gone from 60% to single-digit percentages. So more poverty reduction has happened after 1970 than in the many centuries before that point. And viewers of this channel know that half of all economic progress has actually happened after the year 2000, as I describe in this video up here. So these are two very common metrics by which I could show how much human progress has occurred after 1969, thereby demolishing the premise that that was the peak of human progress and everything has been downhill since. But I'm going to show you yet another metric that is not highlighted quite as much. This is an old school website. As you can see, it's a design from the 90s, but nonetheless, it contains some good information. What if I told you that 99% of all skyscrapers in the world were actually built after the moon landing, after the summer of 1969? 99%. And to give you an idea, these are the world's tallest buildings in 1960, and you can include all the blue ones because they were under construction and therefore finished before 1969. There are only about 30, as you can see, that qualify as skyscrapers taller than 130 meters. And the vast majority are in one city, New York City, and the only ones outside the United States are a couple in Russia, one in Poland, one in Canada. That's it. In the 1960s, skyscrapers were a very unusual thing. Outside of New York City, most places had just 0 or maybe 1 or 2, but the number of tall buildings in the world was very, very few. Today, the number that exists in 2022 is easily about 100 times this amount. So for this, we go to the next chart, which is cumulative annual production. Check this out. This is actually two charts in one. The smaller one is cumulative number of 200-meter plus buildings in existence from 1960 onwards. So the cutoff in the previous chart was 183 meters. This is 200 meters. And the source that I'm going to show you after this one is 150 meters, but you get the idea of proportionality of skyscrapers. So very little until 1960, and then 1970 onwards it grows, and then it grows very, very quickly after that point. And these are individual 1-year gaps versus 10-year gaps, of course. But now it's no longer surprising when you see this chart that my statement about how 99% of skyscrapers in the world were built after 1969, because you can see that's true. And this is cumulative building per year. So remember, this is not the grand total. This is just new building per year. And it only goes up to 2017. There's ongoing exponential growth in the number of skyscrapers even after that point, despite COVID. So as of 1960, there's just very little over here. This chart only starts in 1960. Only a little bit built even through the 1960s, and then around 1969, 1970, it took off. But even what was produced in the 1970s and 80s is much less than what is being produced today, because now we have China, and China is where there are by far the largest number of skyscrapers in the world. But nonetheless, the United States has continued to build more and more, as I'll show you later in this video. So the world of 1969 would seem very, very sparse in terms of skyscrapers relative to today. We can look at the skylines of certain major cities, and you would be shocked at how scant they look relative to today. I'll show you some U.S. cities, and obviously the biggest contrast is in China, which had no skyscrapers back in 1969. It was one of the poorest countries in the world at that time, as you can learn about in this video over here, where I talk about the economic history of China over the last several decades. But even U.S. cities, let's look at a few pictures. This is downtown Los Angeles, 1969. There's nothing there. There's almost no tall building there at all. Compared to today, this looks like it has virtually no tall buildings, nothing that could qualify as a skyscraper at all. Downtown Los Angeles, 1969. Do you see this? This is downtown Chicago in 1970. 1970, the John Hancock Tower was already built, but the Sears Tower, now known as the Willis Tower, was not built at all. Neither was the Aon Center building. So this is 5 or 6 skyscrapers, but not more than that, versus about 130 skyscrapers today. And the number of skyscrapers being built is growing substantially, even in cities that don't have very high population growth. And I could show you a lot of cities. The most extreme would be Shanghai or Hong Kong or something like that. But even Chicago, a place not associated with growth over the last 50 years, the number of tall buildings is much, much more and is rising. Chicago of 2030 or 35 will be much more densely populated still with skyscrapers, just based on that trajectory that we saw. So let's look at some actual data. This is the Skyscraper Center page, which will be in the description box below, and it lists cities and countries by numbers of buildings. And previously, as we saw, lists have had cutoffs of 200 meters, 183 meters. But over here, what's good is that the cutoff is 150 meters. And then the subset of that that's over 200 meters is listed, and the subset of that that's over 300 meters is also listed. China, of course, has the most of any country in the world, 2,717 skyscrapers, more than 3 times as many as the United States. And Chinese skyscrapers are much newer, which we'll look at. But the United States still has 853, which is not a small number. So let's go to China first. In China, we see the number we saw before, 2,717 skyscrapers completed, but 569 are under construction. And since construction takes 1 to 3 years on average, in 3 years' time, there's going to be 3,200 or more such skyscrapers. And the average age is only 11 years. So that tells you how quickly China came up with a huge amount of skyscrapers. And yes, we know about China overbuilding certain things, but overbuilding is better than underbuilding, as I've spoken about in other videos on this channel. 11 years is the average age of skyscrapers in China, despite there being 2,717. But fine, it's also been the fastest growing major economy in the world over the last 30 years as well. So we go back. So now we click on the United States. 853 are constructed, but 63 are under construction. That's good. The United States is still building skyscrapers. And 63 out of 853 is not a small number, because the United States' earliest skyscrapers were made in the late 1920s, around 1930, so almost a century ago. The Empire State Building, for example, the Terminal Tower in Cleveland, Ohio, the Chrysler Building in New York City, these are all buildings that were completed in 1930, 92 years ago. So 63 under construction, and the average age is not extremely high, 32 years. And you can even go down over here and look at this chart. While this chart only begins in 1972, you can see the gray bars, which is the number of completions. And the blue dots, which are individual towers, like when you see a blue dot hanging out in a very outside location, this was the World Trade Center Freedom Tower 2014, which is 541 meters tall. And 2022-23 completions are already easy to predict because these are skyscrapers that are almost completely done, but now future ones also get added. So this is the history of U.S. skyscraper construction, at least from 1972 onwards, the last 50 years. The chart doesn't go back to 1930, but those earlier charts that we saw give you some idea for that. So it's continuing to happen. In the mid-1990s, there was a slowdown. Skyscrapers were out of fashion, but now they're coming back again. So this is New York City, Chicago, all these places like that. We can look at cities that we looked at before as well. Chicago, this is what downtown Chicago looks like today in contrast to that photo we saw from 1970 as an example. One can even click on individual cities. If I go to New York City, which was the first city to have many skyscrapers, you can see 300 are completed. So that's 300 out of the 853 in the United States, but 20 are under construction. There are 20 new skyscrapers under construction in New York City on top of the 300 that already exist. So they're still building. And this is a New York City chart if you wanted to look at an individual city. So you can play around in this website with virtually any city that you want, provided it has some skyscrapers. So there is a lot of data to look at over here. So as we saw, the world went from just maybe 30 skyscrapers in the 1960s to over 5,000 skyscrapers today. More than 99% of skyscrapers that have been built ever have been built after a man landed on the moon. So by that metric, the amount of human progress that has occurred is truly huge. Coming back to this chart, does it really look like human progress peaked over here, 1970, or over here? No, it doesn't. The construction of skyscrapers, the advancements in technology and engineering practices that have enabled increasingly robust and slender buildings to be built, thereby increasing the amount of square footage available for living space and office space, and allowing the beneficial network effects of density to occur, has actually enabled a lot of new economic activity. Places like Hong Kong and Singapore can only exist because of skyscrapers, because they got enough important people into a certain amount of land. The same goes for Manhattan in New York City and a whole bunch of other places across the world too. Even older cities are starting to build skyscrapers. London has a number of new skyscrapers. They could have started building skyscrapers over a century ago, but now the maturity of the technology and the costs of skyscraper engineering are low enough that they are rolling out more skyscrapers now that the technology is commoditized. And fine, nothing wrong with that. They waited until it became cheaper and more reliable to build skyscrapers. So this is occurring, and if the average age in China was just 11 years, in the United States was just 32 years, that means that just to maintain the same average age, the number of skyscrapers has to double in the United States over the next 32 years, or in China over the next 11 years. China won't grow that fast forever, but the United States, to stay at an average age of 32, they have to build another 853 skyscrapers in the next 32 years just to keep the average age at 32. And we'll see how that shakes out. But under this trend, that's not going to be a problem because more and more cities are creating more and more, including New York City, including Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles. They're all building a lot of new skyscrapers, even in the United States. So this is very fascinating because I combined a lot of different data points together. But lest you think that human technological progress has stalled or is limited to things like Moore's law in computation, think again. This comprises a substantial element of progress, and it's very visually stark. Modern skylines have a lot of buildings that are far more impressive than those 1970 skylines I showed you of Los Angeles and Chicago. This is something to not overlook. People don't notice things like this, but these are important exponential trends that underpin human progress and advancement of technologies that become commoditized and increase living standards. And I want everyone to think about that. So a lot of food for thought in this video. And if you like this type of content and these types of stories that are data-backed and supported by a lot of charts, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching.